What's up, and welcome to the TransMatter Podcast. It's your boy Josh De La Ghetto, and here we are with the first ever episode of TransMatter. So TransMatter is basically this idea I've had in my head for a really long time of a podcast where it's me talking about various topics and the world through my lens as a transmasculine person. And it's kind of crazy to get to this point. There's been a lot of ups, a lot of downs in my life as a trans person, as a person just navigating the world. And I felt like it was time to have a place, a space, and a time where I can kind of share these ideas and see what other people think about them. For me, I've been involved in the community for a really long time, not just as someone who's been maybe visible, but as someone who's held different groups, different leadership opportunities and internships, and basically have pretty much seen both like generational impact and just the idea of what does it kind of mean to talk about being trans, not just in the everyday life of maybe hanging around straight and cis people, but in the community and just all kind of walks of life. So one of the first topics that I had mentioned in that whole plethora of categories was masculinity. So I thought for the first podcast, it'd be really awesome to talk about, I guess, how I define masculinity, but also how that has changed over time, and I've kind of had to redefine masculinity for myself. So I think about masculinity in my life as stages and kind of going through understanding it, not understanding it, trying to break down the societal thoughts, and then somehow falling back into them. And then having to break free from that and kind of analyzing myself and being okay with checking myself, and realizing what was okay and what was just me kind of living and breathing off of privilege that I had now gained. And I laugh because it's kind of like a super ironic thing. But getting into it, I guess, growing up, I think I pretty much had, a general idea of what masculinity and femininity kind of look like just based off of factors of being someone who was born in America. And although I was born in America, I am a first generation American. So my family is born, raised from Ethiopia, Africa. And so I think there's just a lot of general ideas of what a wife should do, what a mother should do, what does caring for yourself look like, and how that kind of comes second, and learning kind of not the happiness in femininity or not seeing the positivity. And I think that for me, I always found myself kind of at the forefront of arguing or yelling on the behalf of women in my life. And it wasn't something where I felt like I was needed or had to come to somebody's rescue, but it was something that always stuck with me as feeling that there was just no respect and regard for women and not really understanding why that was so. So growing up, I always saw masculinity as two things. This one side where it can kind of be vicious, not as helpful, pretty toxic, but then also seeing this other side of just the same interests I have seem to societally be aligned with masculinity. I really like sports. I found myself really into maybe music that at the time, hip hop or being aggressive hip hop, seeming as something that was deemed as masculine, which is very interesting, just how gendered everything is, and things I watched, toys I had, the way I dressed, so many different factors that for me as a kid, I just liked what I like, but we get told and pushed into these boxes of trying to understand what's masculine and what's feminine. And I think that a lot of the time there's this concept that it's healthy to be this way until this age. And I think for myself, I often heard the term tomboy and never quite understood it or identified with it. And when I say understand, I don't mean that I literally don't understand the term, but what I do mean is that we are, as humans, so flexible and so fluid and able to have so many different traits and things that we like and hobbies, that it's so weird to me to think that tomboy is something that has to be a category when it can just be someone who has different interests that also identifies as a girl. But that's beyond the point right now. So for myself, I've always heard that term and always felt like, okay, it's a way that other people categorize me, but I quite just feel like a human existing or just a kid doing kid stuff. So I think growing up, I found myself more and more confused by why what I chose to do as hobbies or as interests had to always put me in a different category. So one thing I always noticed in high school, or not even high school, but elementary school rather, is that I was always on the boys' side. There was always games that we would play, cops and robbers, things like that of sort. And it'd be like boys versus girls. And for some reason, it was so normalized for me to be on the boys' side and for everyone to kind of just recognize that. And it never became a weird thing. It wasn't until obviously middle school and things changed and people are into running and doing all these things and getting sweaty. Those kind of differences started to break more and people were realizing who I was. And so I think growing up, I always saw masculinity in those two ways. But for me, I always really identified with the idea of kind of being the cool, laid back, quiet type of guy who has interests in maybe masculine things. But at the end of the day, was able to just joke around and hang out with anyone. At this time, sexuality and orientation, behavior, identity, however you want to say it, wasn't really on my mind. I felt like I knew that I liked girls, but it wasn't something that I talked about or fully understand or worked through. And I know a lot of the times when we talk about gender, when we talk about sexuality, we talk about making sure that the two are very separate. And for myself, I think that in being a young kid and first having experiences of like what is my sexuality and realizing that that was so tied into the thoughts of earlier perceptions of gender that somehow it kind of all came full circle and both were just as important to finding out my gender, rather than it just be figuring out gender and that working out for me. So either way, that was kind of the idea as a child. As I got older, I started to see masculinity in the way of being just able to have such control and, I guess, presence in a space. You know, I think I went to an all-girls Catholic school, and the way that I would see sometimes girls would talk about guys or, you know, kind of have these ideas about guys, it kind of let guys be anyone and having the ability for any girl to be attracted to them. And that was always so interesting to me because I would see my friends and people I know work so hard to achieve certain beauty standards or goals to be something that men would be interested in or boys would be interested at that time rather, and kind of feeling like the freedom for guys to exist was so vast. That always interested me. And I know that in a way when I talk a little bit more about the future and redefining, that changes. But I think a lot of what attracted me to the idea of fully identifying as myself as a man is the idea of having freedom to do what I want, to know that I can achieve what I want. And I think when we talk about these things nowadays, about things that are written on t-shirts for boys versus girls, or, you know, the kind of the messages that get sent to youth, you know, we say this in such an obvious, blatant way, but these are things that really do, I think, change perception and change what a child can think about what's possible for them. I mean, it seems like when you're a young girl between the ages of maybe like as young as 7 or 8 or maybe even younger, there's already this idea of you will be a bride, you will be a mother and so forth one day, and how that will kind of be more so the goal of your life than anything else. And that always terrified me. And that was always something I didn't want because I saw how women were treated. It didn't have much to do with me wanting to go ahead and realize and go through this process of, transitioning socially, medically, and all that. But it definitely did play a role in me recognizing that I never wanted to be that type of masculine person or guy. And I'm not saying that there's not people who understand points of views or walkthroughs and, address themselves. But I do think that in my experiences, it's been rare to find individuals who are really open to talking to people of the community and trying to understand things. And I think the change aspect is so slim. But I don't want to say it's impossible. But I think sometimes there is that negate or that fight, that repelling between trying to get our community and cis, straight, masculine folks to come together in a way that can be anything from socialization to even law, right? So it's a battle. And it comes down to even something as simple as a child looking through the lens of what is gender and what are people putting on me. So I touched upon that for a bit, but now I want to get into redefining masculinity. So when thinking about redefining masculinity for me, it kind of really started in the process of being in high school. Like I mentioned earlier, all of the thoughts and different things that were going on for myself and trying to figure out in the beginning were kind of like elementary school and younger, maybe till birth. But once I started being in high school, I realized just how out of place I felt. And it wasn't just about interests or hobbies. It was just something that in some ways is indescribable, but can be described to like a T in an academia type of way. But a lot of things just didn't feel as correct. And I couldn't at the time really understand. And it was interesting to see at the time the folks who knew me and could maybe see that I was struggling with my identity and were able to have conversations and check in with me. And I think that was one of the few things that really broke my perspective on masculinity. At a young age, about 15, 14, I started to attend an LGBT youth center. And when I went there, it was very mind-blowing for me because of the fact that I, at the time, felt like there were no queer people in the world. Like there was like maybe 12 or 13, and it wasn't such a large and vast community that existed even at this time. I mean, at this time it was about the year of 2008, 2009. And so it wasn't that queer people weren't on TV or weren't already fighting for their rights or doing the different ways that, we may know queer history in the past. But it wasn't still something as open or vast or able to search with technology the way we do today, honestly. And so at this time when I went, there were just so many people that I felt like I connected with that were from all walks of the community, ethnicities, all these intersectionalities that existed. And I found myself, always kind of being compared in some ways or being judged for certain things. When I would talk to friends or hang out with friends, there'd always be a conversation or discussion about other folks they knew who were more masculine than me, who were assigned female at birth, and how they were maybe in some ways more right to be trans or exist in a masculine space than I did, or being in queer spaces and then being compared to other people. And it always felt very hard for me to understand what was really meant for me. One day when I was at a summer camp that this youth space actually holds, I went for a walk with a mentor of mine, and they had basically came out to me about their trans identity and had talked to me about my identity, and hearing how I talk about myself and how I introduce myself with, both my birth name and the name that I want to go by, and kind of hearing that I wanted to use both he and her, but always saying preferably he, preferably this name. And, it wasn't until he asked me, you say preferably, but what is it that you kind of want? Is it that you feel that you hold both of these identities? Are you afraid to declare what it is that you feel? And that was the first time that I really realized how much masculinity had to do with communication. Not necessarily being able to dominate or seem like the savior, but actually being the one who can work through a situation with someone else. Because for me, I couldn't answer that question, and it felt like I knew the answer at the same time. But it took me on a journey from that point forward of always thinking, what type of man do I want to be? What type of masculine person do I want to be? You know, I don't want to be everyone's role model, but I don't also want to be a shitty ass person. You know, I want to exist and help other people and help the world grow into something. I don't want to feel like my existence is a waste of some sort. But yeah, so in that time period, I realized that, and I was able to always have really great masculine friends around me who themselves were not always kind of just stuck on the other things that I would kind of run into when being in other bigger social groups or people. And it was always so interesting to me because of the fact that I surrounded myself with all sorts of masculine people, even masculine women who were a part of the community or not. And it always seemed like me, at the end of the day, the people that I grew closest to or felt the like best vibes from were the people who were willing to joke around and look stupid and have fun and not worry about what is so-and-so thinking about me as a man and my ability to do X, Y, and Z. As I got older, and I think obviously experiences and sex and dynamics of friendships started changing, I saw how much masculinity and things like that were so sex driven or so driven on the idea of power over having power, having money, having the ability to do X, Y, and Z. It seemed like the idea of manhood was being able to do everything for everyone, regardless of what it felt like to be tired or emotionally drained or anything like that. And I didn't really come to that understanding until I started testosterone. I feel like once I started testosterone, and it was something that was apparent to the world, where my gender was now starting to be recognized by strangers and people who didn't know me, right? It became something where I saw what societally men were not only given, but expecting to be given from other people. And it blew my mind. It was so crazy to me. One example that I share with my partner is the littlest things, as far as being in a store, you know, and there being several women in front of me and being told like I'm next to go to the cashier, me pointing out to the cashier, hey, these three women, and kind of them not speaking up or feeling weird too. And the situation in general was weird. Like, I'm not gonna say like it made sense, but it was so interesting how I felt like everything kind of started to change in a way where the world was catered to me. And I'm not gonna say that it was only positives, like there were some negatives, but a lot of the world seemed to change in a way that I've never experienced before. I feel like when the world was reading me as a black, masculine, lesbian, I would receive, nothing but dirty looks, questionable looks, inappropriate questions, doors slammed in my face, disgusting food, cold coffee, all these things. And it felt like once the world started seeing me as the man that I felt that I always was, there was this sudden respect now that I had earned without really ever deserving, or I don't know, like it just was something that was so different. And some of you might be thinking, well, that's fucking great. That sounds amazing. Why wouldn't you want that? And, to some extent, that's true, but it was something that I couldn't really fathom, man. Like, it was so weird. It's even so hard to just put into words right now, but it was something I really couldn't understand. And there was points where I realized going out, I would be with a group of like 8 girls, and guys would come up to me like, hey, can I talk to her? Can I talk to this? And I'd be like, man, you think this one guy, me, my little old self, is like the Mac daddy of all these girls? Like, no, man. Like, they all have their own agency. They're all able to talk to themselves. Like, you don't have to come up to me. But it was so interesting how going out now, I had this vision to other people of ownership or taking care of women that I went to, going out and always getting the bill first, and, being given all these things that I just never really experienced before. And, there's so many more, obviously, that I'm just kind of running through these ideas and stories just to not make a super long podcast. But, these are real things that I experienced and, are going to dive into more later on. But it's definitely been interesting. even aspects of space, given space so much. I live in New York City, especially riding the train, there's never space, but it was interesting how much more space I was allowed to take up or even given without even taking up. There would be so many times where I would kind of just try to like understand and close my legs and not be so demanding or man spacing, right? And still people feeling, women or just men, other men feeling like, okay, I'm not gonna sit there, he's got that, or I'm gonna try to make myself as small as I can so he can feel that he has enough space. And even when trying to give folks more space, no, it's okay. And before, I would literally just have people all up in my face, hitting me, not even saying sorry. And a lot of folks might sound like, what? Like, I think you're just exaggerating. But, I think the way that the world values a black woman, versus how, and a queer black woman, versus how the world will respect or see a man, and a black man at that, or fear, is vastly different. And the experiences are crazy to me. And, I think those are kind of just the more blatant things about masculinity that were coming up for me. These experiences are talking about those specifically. I bring them up because I do understand there is a general societal idea of like, oh, a man means strong, able to do this, someone who's able to care for this. I'm not being specific because I think y'all able to fill in the blanks, and I think with all of that in mind, it just never really registered with me, dog. Like, it was kind of like, all right, you're saying a man is a man because he's strong. Well, shit, women are strong. Oh, you mean physically strong? Well, shit, women are physically strong, So I always had that mindset growing up where someone will kind of debate me on, I don't know, maybe boys being the better people to win a game or something to that extent. I've always thought to myself, well, maybe you, the guy who I'm arguing with, maybe you're better at this game than this specific woman. But that has nothing to do with whoever maybe lives in 3 states down who could totally whoop your ass in this game. So for me, it was always just feeling like women were always being dismissive as certain traits that people hold for men, when I'm kind of like, man, that's just more about personality, man. That's more how you navigate stuff. So that general idea never really stuck with me, and that's why I didn't touch upon it. But like I said, masculinity really started to change for me once I started testosterone, because mentally there was a lot that were changing, but the way society started to change me really made me see just how much can be catered. And I mentioned earlier, like, some of those maybe perceived positives, but there were some negatives. I feel like right around the time that people started recognizing me and who I was, it became more and more threatening in some ways to police departments. And I say that because during the time, the first year of me transitioning and having access to hormones specifically, was the year that stop and frisk was not only in effect, but in high effect in New York City. And some of you who don't know stop and frisk, just kind of talking off the top of the dome right now, from my memory, it was that a police officer can basically kind of pull up on you and have the right to frisk you on your person. And if you do have something illegal like marijuana, or alcohol, you're underage, or I'm sure there's many different things, but that's kind of just my experience. You're able to not get a ticket. You can get a ticket on the discretion of the officer, but actually go be booked and go inside the cell and go to the precinct. And so during this time, I was stopped and frisked, multiple times, and followed. And some of you might say, how do you know you're followed? It's New York City, so many cop cars. I literally live a block away from the train station at this time, and another like 2 blocks away from the precinct. And so every time I got out the train station, if you're following me home, literally like across the street, I'm gonna know. You literally have to go like 3 miles per hour to follow me walking home. And so those are just some examples, or walking in other places or areas, and just a bravery of pulling up and assuming or trying to book me to crimes just because, and having to check my ID. And so there was, I would say, a good like 80% higher percentile of stop, frisk, and police directly approaching me or trying to arrest me. And those were some of the things that I saw change. And I think in some way that added to then what my masculinity was becoming, which was numbness and coldness. And it wasn't just because of that experience or those experiences with NYPD, but the experiences of chemical changes going on in my brain. You know, I think there was a point in time where I felt a little scared to agree with some of the stereotypes I've heard about men, and found myself experiencing some of those things. And I'll get more into that when I have my specific podcast about testosterone. But just for now, kind of lightly touching on it, it just felt very hard to empathize, sympathize, let emotion besides anger or happiness at extreme moments run through my body, honestly speaking. And so for me, it was like, okay, I can understand why the perception of a man might be cold or might be unable to communicate, and examining all of that, right? And like feeling like, oh, but that's not me. I'm not that type of guy. And just realizing that it wasn't that I am incapable, but things were changing within me that I just didn't know. And so it was foreign to me. I didn't know how to think in this process of being on T or you know, having these new experiences with this new kind of adolescence brain. So having all of that come together, it helped me realize I needed to slow the fuck down, man. Just slow down, examine shit, journal, think, what is life? And I found myself in that realm. And it was so confusing. On one hand, I felt that it was great, but I felt that I was taking from others. But it felt great to be seen. It felt great not to have to correct people's pronouns all the time. I was still getting misgendered, but to not have to be on pins and needles every second. And then it kind of felt like a guilt trip, because it felt like I started to assimilate, I guess, or become or see that I was this straight hetero man navigating the world. And it created this discomfort within me that I was no longer part of the community, or people no longer regarding me the same way and being shunned from trans groups or trans people. It was very confusing for me, because I felt that it was like blissfulness, but then also denial, and feeling like I just wasn't in either world, but I knew I deserved to be in both, if that makes sense. And I think the more and more that I became seen to the world as this masculine or extreme, or maybe more on the masculine spectrum, the more it allowed me to have comfort to question people, you know, question why did they respect me and what did it really come down to, and actually feel more comfortable in exploring myself. There was a lot of things that I never wore that I was afraid to say that I enjoyed, just because I felt like people were on such thin ice with respecting my masculinity and pronouns, that for me to joke around the way that I was used to or play around, it would just give them the instant like gratification or right or ability to misgender me and feel, you know, valid in that, or feel like, of course I would, look how you do this or that. And getting back to that place of being like, man, fuck it, I'm gonna just be me, do how I am, joke how I am, be the guy that I am. And just finding more freedom, like I kind of talked about earlier. And I was met with a lot of homophobia from it. And I say homophobia because in the way that I joked around or was with friends, I felt more comfortability wearing colors that were brighter or maybe softer. I felt more comfortability cycling and listening to Ariana Grande out loud. I mean, I felt more comfortability in like wearing Britney Spears t-shirts and NSYNC t-shirts. I just felt more comfortable in being like, yeah, this is like shit that I like besides hip hop or besides the things that you deem as gangsta, hard or masculine or aggressive. And that's okay. And now that I'm comfortable, I feel that I can do that and not wonder how I'm being seen. And it wasn't until one day I had someone say some homophobic slurs with that energy behind it and tried to physically intimidate me that I realized people's perception had now switched to me being a gay man and how much that affected my safety. And And it was interesting to see how much my masculinity could be so many different things to so many different places, depending on who I was with, where I was, what group I was a part of, how people addressed me. And it was interesting to see how much sometimes being in queer spaces, people respected my masculinity so much they were afraid to be themselves, and I would have to reassure them they were fine. And then being in spaces where straight men would stay away from me and I want to kind of just get to know me and just be cool with me, based on the fact that they felt like I could be gay because of what I was wearing or what my interests were, how fluidly I was able to get along with both women and men and their comfortability with that. So navigating masculinity has definitely been a motherfucking journey, but I really can say that who I am today and what I am like today is just a beautiful thing. And I could never in a million years imagine this is who I am and live my truth and, you know, all that yada yada great stuff we hear all the time. But it's honest, man, and it's real, because defining masculinity is not easy. And I could hear this exact podcast 10 years from now and be like, oh, what a little baby. I thought I knew so much. But that's actually the beauty of it. I think just being able to be open and hear people's point of views and learn so much. Like, it's so interesting because I feel my definition of masculinity now has so much more of not necessarily pertaining to a gender and being non-binary itself, but kind of more so pertaining to the idea of being a strong communicator, to being someone that can be able to be present for myself and for people, and just having more of what it means to be a man, more about what it means to be human. You see what I did there, right? But all jokes aside, you know, that's really what it did for me, and that's what it meant for me. And it's just been amazing. And I just want to take the time out right now to say, if you're listening to this, thank you so much for hearing my story and my journey. And like I said previously, I definitely am going to talk more about masculinity as the podcast goes on, and having more topics specifically pertaining to what was masculinity like for me on T, so forth, so forth. So before we go, I just want to say, you know, everything that I say in this podcast is my perspective, my life, my experiences. But that does not mean that I'm not open to other people's perspective and experiences. So if you ever hear something in the podcast you want clarification on, or you want to correct me on, you know, please feel free to do that. There'll definitely be spaces. Obviously, you can comment below, or somehow find a way to reach us, but there's definitely going to be information provided on who you can reach out and how. So please don't ever feel like you have to be angry if you feel I've said something incorrectly. Just please know that I'm coming with open arms, open mind, open love. So I'm open to hearing it all. So don't be afraid to reach out. So I just want to say thank you again. This is your boy, Josh DeLaGhetto, and thank you for listening to the first ever episode of TransMatter.